Friends, this morning I want to encourage you to reconsider that video that we showed you earlier in the service. And I want you, in light of that video, to hear the gospel reading from Luke this morning. And we're going to reread this parable every week through this series. So please open your hearts and minds to hear God's word and to consider some of the images from that video that we saw. So Jesus continued, "There was a man who had two sons. The younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate.' So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all that he had and set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his field to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, 'How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare? And here I am starving to death. I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and he went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. And he ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick, bring out the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and has been found.' So they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field, and when he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called to one of the servants and asked him what was going on. 'Your brother has come,' he replied, 'and your father has killed the fattened calf, because he has him back safe and sound.' The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered to his father, 'Look, all these years I have been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him.' 'My son,' the father said, 'you are always with me, and everything I have is yours.'" So friends, I want us to take a couple moments of reflection to look at our picture again here, or down here if you can see it, and just let the painting speak to you. What do you notice about the picture as a whole? And what do you notice specifically about the younger son? He's missing some shoes. Okay. What else do you guys notice about that younger son, or about the painting in general? He's poorly dressed, right? And so again, he seems to have just underclothes on, and his underclothes are a pale comparison to the bright or rich red cloak that his father and his brother seem to wear. And even if you were to look at the clothing that the father has on underneath the cloak, they're very richly arrayed, speaking of a wealth and abundance. And this young son's clothes are tattered and worn out. The sandals are broken and falling off, suggesting that there has been a very long and arduous journey, both to this distant land, but also the way back home, that it has not been an easy path. I think it also speaks of some of the external consequences that he has dealt with. What about his head? What do you notice about the younger son's head? It's shaved off, right? And so he looks emaciated. He looks like a prisoner or a POW, someone who's been enslaved compared to, again, the full beard, the full hair of the father and of the brother. Now, friends, I don't know how well you can see it this morning, but if you were to look at the younger son's right hip, you would see a sword. Okay, and scholars have thought that that sword that he maintains is sort of the last vestige of his nobility, of his birthright into this noble family. And so again, his cloak is gone, his sandals are worn out. We know that all of the property and money that he took with to this distant land has run out, and now he comes back in rags. And the only thing that speaks of his former identity is this sword that he holds or is still clasped to his hip. So friends, let's take a few minutes today to unpack or to discuss the coming home of the younger son. And friends, I think we can speak with no doubt that there have been both external as well as internal consequences for this young man. And so as we look at verses 14 through 16, it says, after he had spent everything there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country who sent him in the field to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. And so, friends, just as we've looked at the external depiction of this younger son who comes back broken and starving and worn out, there's no doubt that he's also dealing with extreme inner conflict and trauma. I mean, what does it take for someone to be sitting or to hire themselves out to someone else, right? He basically becomes an indentured servant, right? And back in his ancient period, that wasn't a really big thing. All right? That was pretty commonplace for some people to do that, to sell themselves into servanthood to be able to pay off debts or other things that they had to do. In our modern mind, that's almost a despicable thing, right? I don't think very many of us can even contemplate what it means for us to sell our kids, to sell ourselves into servanthood to pay off some of the debts that we have, right? And so think about the brokenness in this man's spirit as he now realizes that, look, he's of noble lineage. Had he stayed home, he would be enjoying the abundance of the Father, and yet he squandered everything, and now this noble man has to become a servant, an indentured servant to these people in this foreign land. And not only that, but he's also starving. All of the wealth and all of the parties and all of the food that he had before are now gone, and he's peering over a pig trough, longing to eat the slop and the pods that are present there. And yet the owner of the pigs won't even let him indulge in the food that the pigs are eating. Now think about what that means. To have someone that you've hired yourself out to as a servant think you're not even good enough to eat the food for the pigs. Right? What does that say? What does that do to our dignity or even our humanity that someone wouldn't even let us eat the food of animals? And so, friends, there's no doubt that this young man is dealing with intense inner trauma. He's a broken man. He's this young man who comes down and falls at the feet of the Father and burrows his head into the Father's bosom just like he's a little child once again. But friends, as we think and we consider the younger son, I think all of us can understand to some degree what it's like to become entangled in the vicious cycle that the world offers us. And as we talked about in the younger son's departure, there's this idea that we have ambitions and we have motivations and that the grass always seems greener over there. And we try to spend our time figuring out how we can go over there and enjoy those good times, how we can have the success or the wealth or the power or the prestige of these other people. And it draws us away from home. And once we get over there, we find that it's not quite as easy as we thought it was going to be to acquire all of these things. And so we end up finding ourselves having to try to please people in a whole bunch of different ways. And when we succeed, we're happy. But yet at the same time, when we succeed, we also feel the resentment and jealousy of other people who are unhappy because we have succeeded. And when we fail, we too become bitter and we become resentful and jealous of those who have succeeded where we have failed. And then we begin to become more suspicious, more defensive, and we move into a scarcity. You know what? I don't know if I can trust this person because they might not have my best interest in mind. I have to protect what's mine because there might not be enough for me or for others if I am generous with my giving. And friends, as we continue to go down that road, as we ply into that cycle more and more, pretty soon we can become feeling like we're the victims. Like we're the ones that circumstances are against, or that all of these people are against us, preventing us from getting these things we thought would be so easy to acquire. Because again, the grass looked greener from the other side. And we begin to divide ourselves, divide the people in our lives for those people that are for us and those people that are against us. And when people are against us, we feel as if our dignity and our humanity are stripped from us because of their resentment. And yet, at the same time, those who are against us, we too try to strip their dignity and their humanity to make ourselves feel better, to protect us. And friends, as this cycle begins to spin, we find that the world becomes a dark place. Our hope begins to recede, and we find that all of the freedom that we long for in this foreign land becomes a place of slavery, and we've lost our freedom altogether. We've been stripped of the dignity that we so longed for and had in our home, but now find that we no longer have. So friends, let me offer perhaps a little bit more practical example for you. So how many, or what's the percentage of lottery winners that go broke after winning the lottery? It's higher than 50%. It's about 70% of people who win the lottery go broke after winning it, right? And so, you know, I have always kind of tended to look at the lottery as a tax on the poor, right? Because often the people that play the lottery the most often and the most consistently are people who don't have the money to do that, just placing their stake, hoping that one day they're going to win that big prize. But unfortunately, guess what? The odds are stacked against them, and many will never ever realize anything close to the amount of money they spend. And then if they do, the game is still an uphill battle for them, because for many people, if you can't manage $20,000, it's pretty hard to manage $200 million. And so these people that win the lottery, guess what? All of a sudden, they say, wow, I can spend this money. I've never had this much money before, so I can spend it on all these things that I want. And then pretty soon it seems like, wow, look at all these friends I've got because I've got all of this money. And then there's all these investors that are providing me all of these lucrative deals because they know I have money, and if I would just invest in them, my money will grow even more. And maybe I should just buy a jet while I'm at it, or maybe a small private island, and then pretty soon all of a sudden my money is gone and I'm right back to where I was. Or maybe I'm even worse off than I was before I won the money. Because now all of those people that said they cared about me are now no longer even there. And all of the people that I used to hang out with, well, I quit hanging out with them because I had all of these new friends. And so, friends, I too can speak to this from personal experience, not because I've won the lottery, but because I too have wandered from home and I too have fallen into this vicious trap. And so, friends, when I went off to college, I fell into many of these things. And in some ways, I enjoyed college. I loved to learn, and I was good at it. But guess what? I had to try harder and harder because there were always those people that were smarter than me. And no matter how hard I worked, I just could never catch them. And there were people who got mad at me because I was smarter than them and I could do things better than they could. And so they had resentment toward me. And so they were kind of like, oh, he's just kind of stuck up, or he's really arrogant. And yet I had resentment for the people who were smarter than me, because no matter how hard I worked, they were always working even harder. And pretty soon my competitive spirit got to such a point that it began to destroy the relationships, because if I couldn't win, I was going to sabotage you so you couldn't win either. And guess what, folks? When you have that kind of an attitude, it doesn't take very long to start pushing people out of your life, because no one wants to be around somebody that doesn't want to help them or doesn't want them to succeed. And so I found myself burning through relationship after relationship after relationship. And we'll get to what the consequences of that might have been. But friends, as we return to our biblical story, our parable, we find that the turning point for the younger son is basically when he hits rock bottom. And unfortunately for that, despite sometimes the best advice, the best care from people around us, sometimes it takes us to hit rock bottom before we decide that the pain is now greater and it's worth making the change. And so the scripture says, when he finally came to his senses, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you, and I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of the hired servants. And so, friends, as he's sitting there staring at the pods, he has the choice of life or death. And for him, maybe quite literally, he might literally have starved to death in this land had he not made the decision to pack up and go back home. But the problem is he has a misconception about who the Father is. He has a misconception of what his identity is. He manages to say, you know what, I have a home, but guess what? Because of all these bad things I've done, my Father is never going to accept me back. I've burned through, I've made the taboo request to ask for all of the property before I left. How could the Father ever accept me back? But maybe just because he's my Father, maybe he'll give me just enough grace, just enough mercy that he'll bring me back as a servant. And I can work in his house, and at least that way I might be able to have enough bread to get through the day. And friends, sometimes for us it needs to be a life or death choice. And for some people, it is literally that choice. We think about people with mental illness or people caught in addictions. And so God tells the Israelites this in Deuteronomy. He says, this day I call the heavens and the earth as witnesses against you that I have set before you life and death, blessing and curses. Now choose life so that you and your children may live, and that you may love the Lord your God. Listen to his voice and hold fast to him, for the Lord is your life. Think about that for a moment. God gives us a choice. The Father willingly gave this younger son all of the stuff that he wasn't even entitled to have and sent him on his way. And yet the Father said, look, it's really my heart's desire that you don't go. But if you do go, know that I love you. Right? But if you ever want to come back, look, there's a place for you here. There's life here. Out there might be something else. And friends, as we look even at the scriptures, think of the characters of Peter and Judas. right? The fact that these two men both betrayed Jesus. And yet, one of them had the courage to come back and believe that Jesus was good enough to forgive him. The other one didn't think Jesus would forgive him for the things he did, and so he went out and he hung himself. One of them chose life. The other one chose death. And so, friends, again, I can relate to this because when I hit rock bottom at the point that I did, I have to only equate it to a supernatural experience because I was sitting in my home office and it literally felt like the four walls of my office were closing in around me. And I sat at my desk with my Bible open and I was prepared to write some treatise about how God did not exist and how everything in the Bible and how everything I was taught in my early childhood was just a lie. And in that moment, as my fingers literally went and pressed on the keyboard to begin to strike the keys, I heard God's voice, and he said, Josh, you can choose not to follow me, but you can never claim that I do not exist because you have been a witness to too much. And for someone that was going to make rational arguments to go through and explain how all of this biblical stuff and all of my faith was just a big lie, in that moment, that word of truth struck me to the core. It just reverberated. It felt like I'd just been hit by a truck. And in a moment of simple faith, I made the decision that that was truly God. And that was my rock bottom moment. And from there, I said, you know what? I really have to evaluate where I am because guess what? I don't have too many friends left because I burned a whole lot of bridges the last few years. And guess what? I've only been married just a few years and now we're already having problems. So how much longer am I going to go before she's gone? And if she's gone, these guys aren't here. And if I continue down that path, I'm not standing before you today. And who knows where my life might be. And so, friends, I too was faced with the choice of choosing spiritual life or choosing spiritual death. And thank God for his grace and his mercy and his forgiveness. And so, like the younger son, I decided it was time to go home. It was time to return to the Father. But guess what, friends? Sometimes the journey home is a long one. Sometimes it's an arduous one. Sometimes it's a journey that's so painful that by the time we get there, our sandals are blown out and worn out. And the only energy we have left to do is to fall into the arms of the Father who loves us and who forgives us no matter what we've done. And says, guess what? Because of my son Jesus, you are my son. I love you. I forgive you for that. Come and just let me embrace you in my arms. Let me hold you close. And so, friends, just as the young son makes a journey through a long Middle Eastern desert to go home, I too had to start my journey. And it started with an invitation from my wife to say, you know what? I was first attracted to you because of your faith. So why don't you come back to church? Because you haven't been there in, 9 years. Why don't you come back? And friends, those were the first steps on the journey home for me. Now, the other thing I want us to do as we end today is to realize that despite the changes that we go through, despite how the road changes us, that we too can be just like this younger son, that we can come broken, that we can come with all of our clothes worn out. No matter what we look like, no matter what we've done, God will forgive us. But unfortunately, friends, there will be some critical eyes that are looking at us from the sidelines, wondering how the Father could embrace us and what in the world or how do we have the right to come home after we've done what we've done? And so I'll leave you with that for next week. So some action steps for you today, friends. Take some time to reflect on the times that you've had to make the journey home. Because unfortunately, sometimes it's not just once in our life that we wander off, but sometimes it's multiple times, so we have multiple journeys. What perceptions do you have of yourself? Do you think that you're worthy to be called a son or a daughter, or do you think you're only worthy enough to be called a servant? And what perceptions do you have of your Heavenly Father? Is He this judge, this unloving person that's going to say, you know what, you screwed up, you're done? Or is He going to be the gracious, unconditional, loving Father that accepts you back? And like the father in the video we saw, who doesn't just hang out one sheet for your return, He's got the sheets thrown out all the way down the lane, and the whole house is covered of them, and He's standing there waiting for you to come home. And then finally, friends, how can you be an influence to someone who has wandered from home or is making their journey back? And so you may know someone that is in this process, or maybe you are, and you understand how important it is to have people come around you and support you as you journey back home. And so I invite you to be an influence or to invite other people into your story if that is the case. God bless you guys.